This is Bernie Steffen with Ecology Talk Radio. I'm so glad to be with you today. I've got an interesting topic, and the title is Optimized for What? It's an engineer's look at our civilization. I had a first career at Pacific Bell as a software developer, and over 25 years with computer systems, I learned a few lessons. Systems do produce the results they were designed to produce. Sometimes they make mistakes. Clearly, the results are really focused on what was intended. But sometimes they produce unintended side effects. Those side effects can eventually become larger than the original problem. Today, I'd like to look at civilization the way a systems engineer looks at software. Every system begins with requirements. Every engineer begins with three questions. What problem are we trying to solve? What constraints must we work with? There's a budget, there's existing systems, there's standards in place, and then ultimately, what are we optimizing this system for? Those decisions determine the architecture, and the architecture makes certain outcomes highly likely. At Pacific Bell, customer billing services was my area, and we started off with an older system. I started in 1970, and we were working with assembler, with autocoder. We were working at a machine-level language, and that has its own advantages. We were automating work that was done by lots of people working in the 9 accounting offices throughout the state. They were keeping track of what the customer record was. They were making the changes as service orders were written. They were monthly putting the bill together, mailing it out, bringing in the payments. It was an early system to minimize the expenses, and we were very successful at that. Over 1,000 people were ultimately put out of a job because of that automation. That automation turned out to be a lot of programmers who were working as craftspeople that knew how to code well and did that job. But in that process, there wasn't a lot of standardization and mistakes were made. We did design with the plastic templates and a pencil to draw flowcharts. And then we were supposed to maintain those flowcharts. But over time, we stopped doing that. And we went back to the code as we knew it. And pretty soon those systems became a product of who had created them. And that person was the most able to make future changes. If a new programmer was assigned that program, it became increasingly difficult. When we had a system-wide change, we'd meet in a conference room, probably 30 of us representing different parts of the system. And that clearly pointed out that we were architected wrong. Fortunately, at that time, a new system of software called COBOL came into place. And with COBOL, we were able to read the code a lot easier. We're able to manage our part of the system, but we continued to make mistakes. And they were happening more frequently because we were putting out software quicker because of the advanced language. So what we had to do was adopt a better standard for writing code, which we called spaghetti code. It was branched to something and it would take you wherever. But we then made it a structured coding standard where one would go and run a process and then come back to where we started. So there was a lot better structure in place, and we were able to avoid some of the mistakes. But we continued with this isolation of different programmers having different programs, and we were very programmer dependent. That proved to be a problem in the long term as people were promoted, left the company, new programmers came in, and these meetings to discuss what changes would take place was still about people personalizing their software. They'll say, I'll do this and I'll send this to you, meaning from my program to your program. It was very much of a non-engineering approach. And we knew that we had to do better. And we soon started making clear that we had 3 phases. And by the way, in that old system, the testing was done by the programmers. And then we realized we needed to do separate phases of each project where there was a design team that designed for the whole end-to-end process with all the interfaces. And then over time, we made sure that that was handed off to programming, and the programmers were efficient at their programming. They did their own unit testing, but the important testing was really done by a separate team of testers who built up a database of test cases, and it became much more professional. And that's really when we entered the engineering approach. Every system begins with requirements, and the architecture is important. Later, as I retired from Pac Bell and was looking at what our civilization was doing, what was happening in our world, I thought, shouldn't we be looking at the systems that we have in our nation, in our business world, in what is our living systems for growing the material civilization that we all wanted to optimize for? We were optimizing, given that we had abundant energy, for more growth, greater productivity, and ultimately more consumption. Those goals produced extraordinary benefits, but with every optimization come trade-offs. The trade-offs were such that we wound up having, while we had this beyond imagination kind of a lifestyle that we called first world developed countries, and then we wanted the whole world to join us, and so we had developing countries, and we looked down on underdeveloped countries. And that, together with the amazing success that those systems provided us, really accounted for us becoming harmful to the natural world. We experienced the climate change, the disruption, the problem of stressing nature and ourselves to lengths that we hadn't imagined. We had biodiversity loss. We hadn't designed for having a sustainable life. We optimized for something else. And what we got was a consequence of not considering the side effects of what this industrial success ultimately looked like. So I want to emphasize this point again, that growth remained our objective, but what it took a toll on was truly unintended. No one really intended for there to be climate change that would be so disruptive, that would change our lives forever and put us on a trajectory of destroying the natural world. That was clearly a trade-off, a side effect that we really didn't envision. We optimized for growth, and eventually our ecosystems bore that cost. These are not random failures. These are actually predictable trade-offs if we were looking at our industrial civilization through the eyes of a systems engineer. But we weren't. Why do those problems persist? Now, while we try to solve climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, we rarely question the objectives that continue to produce them. We're still optimizing for growth. So many solutions simply became new ways to pursue the same objectives. The operating system wasn't changed at a root level. The systems we have in place are ones that were designed for what we initially wanted. If we were to start over, we might have different priorities. We might choose sustainability. We might choose for doing no harm to an environment up front. And if we adopted and built systems with those priorities, things might be different. The prioritization for what our systems are to achieve was really singly minded on us growing our security, our well-being, our comfort levels, the amount we could consume and the things we could have, the vacations we could take, having a life of luxury and not really dealing with it on the level of at what cost is this coming? More and more people are coming to that conclusion. The systems that we have today are really still built on the prioritizations, on the optimization that they were built with. And so we can't expect that a tinkering with these systems will make a difference. We constantly are seeking to find a better way to have high mobility with electrification of vehicles and to have this 24/7 electric grid that we've become accustomed to and think is normal and believe that we are entitled to because it feels so right. It's what we've grown up with. It's what we're used to. So the changes we keep making to our public systems of business, of industry, of global trade are all focused on more. It's about growth. It's not just that they have grown our population beyond what the earth can handle. They have grown our consumption way beyond what we can handle. And so what are we doing these days with those systems? We're taking them to another level because when we first went to COBOL, that was a big step forward, but it really didn't help us in the long term keep a handle on all of the complexities that were built into this billing system. We were also handing off to the yellow page system. We were producing files for the white pages, and then along came requirements that were imposed by a dissent decree where the Bell system was being sued for being a monopoly and had to allow in competition. Before that, the Bell system had Bell Labs, which would want to certify every plug-in to that system to make sure it didn't degrade the overall service. The technology all the way around on communications was moving so rapidly that it was inevitable that this could no longer continue as a monopoly. So we had to divest from the product side, we had to divest from the yellow pages side, and we had to divest from the long distance service. And ultimately, we had a system where even though the AT&T network had the infrastructure, the wires that would carry all the calls nationwide, internationally, we had to open that up for companies. And the first company that came in to do that was called MCI. They leased their lines to put their toll service over it, and then they were able to do their own billing for it. If customers would sign up for MCI, they would offer cheaper toll rates. The Bell system had been a utility, so was able to subsidize having affordable local service, landline service to everybody in the country, including people in rural areas that really were costing a lot more in terms of provisioning those lines and providing that service to them, but it was seen as a real benefit. So when MCI came along, they didn't have a billing system. So our marketing people at Pat Bell thought, this is a wonderful opportunity. We're going to provide billing as a service. They got very excited about that income now that there was a new playing field that the Justice Department and the settlement with the Bell system had put in place. But to us programmers who had built a system that was for one organization, to make an architectural change to allow other companies, they didn't do their own billing, they didn't do their own provisioning. They were just riding on top of our systems. So our systems had to change. So that was hard in the architecture we had at the time. But then we moved to databases. DEEB was the database I remember that is a relational database, and it starts with modeling relationships. That's what our civilization hasn't done. It hasn't changed to that degree to start modeling a whole nother set of requirements and priorities to serve. We had no choice. And we made those changes being pushed by the timeline. Our marketing team was putting pressure on IT, weren't ready. There was so much change that when we tested, we kept making mistakes. And I remember we were coming down to the deadline, and I'd become a manager at the time of a programming group. And I raised my hand that said, we are not ready for implementing this change. Top down, we were told, that's not acceptable. Get ready. You must be ready. And of course, we were having problem with where we always had problem, that was interfaces between one program and another. Those interfaces, those relationships, and how they were handled, both in architecture and design, was not optimum. And we created some massive problems. I remember having to have our customer service people, which were another department, have to reach out to all of the customers whom we had overbilled or under what we called vouchers, credits to their bill that had to be manually processed. And so the cost that was unforeseen came about, I say, in the same way that our civilization has costs that came about because we continued in a direction that we were wanting to optimize for. More growth, more of the lifestyle that we'd become accustomed to, which included mobility. Not only cars that we now want to pretend that by changing them from an internal combustion engine that is petroleum powered, gas powered, to electric motors with batteries that supposedly are running on clean energy. We had believed our own hype about renewable energy. We kept saying that the wind is free, but a wind farm doesn't come cheap. It requires mining, manufacturing, installation, maintenance, and then for a limited time only. That part wasn't being discussed in the public where we were being sold renewable energy. Yes, solar is indeed free in terms of heating us if we approach it with a passive solar design for how we orient our house, how we live as humans always have to take advantage of the sunlight and the warmth that it provides, even do the cooking with a parabolic mirror to concentrate that energy. But again, we were fooled, and I include myself in that. I was definitely fooled by this notion that renewable, of course, is going to go on forever. Well, we now see that's nonsense. We were way oversubscribed when we held this notion that we could drive a car 60 miles in an hour. We could drive across the state, across the Bay Area, across the bridge to go to work. We could fly to the other side of the continent easily within a day. We could fly across oceans. We could see the world and think nothing of it. When people go on trips now, do they think about how much harm is being done by the burning of the fuel in those jets that came from somewhere and puts out emissions of carbon dioxide? No, we don't think about that. We think about how wonderful it would be to see Paris, to visit Madrid, to go to a World Cup soccer match in Mexico. We have conditioned ourselves to not think in terms of what it is costing the living planet, including ourselves, and most importantly, future generations. We keep not recognizing that the systems we have were not designed to make them less harmful. We want to produce less of that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We think in terms of how can we use our existing system? Let's put a tax on the carbon emissions. And of course, that'll cause people to think twice about how many emissions they have, or companies to think that way. Corporations really aren't concerned with the natural world. Nonprofits exist and money has been put towards studying the problem. But no matter how much we study it, no one comes up to see what the overall extent of our industrialization, of our way of living today that we consider normal, can somehow be turned around so that we keep all the goodies, but don't do the damage. That's not possible. I'm suggesting that we are no different than the systems that we produce, and unless we start optimizing for healthy watersheds, for keeping healthy soils, not depleting them, not taking the water from the aquifers, and like the one in the middle of the country, the Ole aquifer, it's quickly being drained dry. And that supports most of the industrial agriculture that is happening in this country. And if it's not there, it's from water from dams that have kept the wildlife from its natural habitat and therefore is having them dwindle in populations and ultimately go extinct. What we do then do is use our immense knowledge to try to study these species that are going extinct and try to figure out how can we prevent that. It's a little late when you're in the emergency room to think about how you could live a better lifestyle, how you could eat better, how you could live better. We have got the problem that we try to fix the symptoms of. And what I want to keep emphasizing on this show, and we'll continue to do it in various ways, is suggest that if we tried to optimize our systems for life instead of for human enjoyment, entertainment, and wealth, and accumulation of things, and owning property, and owning things, and being able to inherit that wealth and pass it along to future generations, that would be the desired outcome. No, the desired outcome, the priority has to be put all of that aside, even though everybody wants it. What we should want more, what we should optimize for is the living systems, the biosphere, the ecosystems, the watersheds where we live. I don't see any alternative but to return to the pre-industrial age and how indigenous people lived. They were not causing climate change. They were not causing mass extinction. They were living simply. They were living locally for the most part until they had civilizations like the Romans that wanted to conquer the rest of the world and build empire, and the other European countries that wanted to colonize South America, North America, the Caribbean, Central America, but also Africa. They all claimed a stake from the top-down hierarchy, which was a combination of the monotheist kings and queens and the concentration of power with the support not only of the church, but of the king. So these kings and queens and religious leaders really conspired to set us on the path that we now lament today and are still trying to fix the symptoms. Our system of industrial civilization is doomed. We need to accept that. And if we want to re-engineer how we live, let's remember that what we optimize for, that we set out as our main priorities, that's what we have to consider our systems around. I see that as bioregional trade instead of global trade. I see it as people doing more of their own growing of food, building a shelter, more of their own mending and making of clothes, doing trade and barter at a local level, living in a community where you're self-governing, not having laws imposed to you by people in places like Sacramento or Washington, D.C. While most of us are suffering the trauma of what a president can do within this system by ignoring the rules. And a party that is bigger than the checks and balances that we were taught in school that our government was designed around, that the Supreme Court would keep a check on both the Congress and the president in the laws that were made to make sure that those ideals that we held when we became independent of tyranny, that they would hold. But no, nowadays, party counts more, and a strong leader of a party who terrorizes all the people who might go against him, that is what we got now. And I think in one way, people seeing that and recognizing that can help us see through our belief that the United States of America was in a glorious place 20 years ago that we long to get back to. I suggest we were in a more glorious place when we were first created and wanted self-rule. We did come together for mutual defense. That made sense. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what that system that we so thought was the best in the world that we exported and other countries wanted to emulate turned out to be an environmental disaster, along with challenging our political systems, our alliances, our United Nations, NATO, free trade. We think that was such a wonderful thing to have this almost costless transportation of container ships because fossil fuels were so cheap. Well, I'm delighted that the fossil fuels are going up in price, although not nearly fast enough, in my opinion. We think that $6, $7, $8 a gallon is outrageous. I would suggest that the petroleum should be priced at more like $100 or $200 a gallon so that we didn't waste it as much as we do, that we could hold ourselves together until we could come to my experience at Pac Bell. It took us a while to get to the new technology, the database driven that ultimately went to client server, that became the internet, where the servers were so separated from the clients that were the apps on our phone. And the implementation today of AI, what we know today about its negative effects are the amount of power that it needs to run. And that's understandable because it's making billions of computational decisions in split-second time. That takes power. When we have an app on our mobile devices that has that kind of power, the problem becomes our phones heat up, and the problem becomes they're overheating. We know how to throw a lot of power at something, but we pretend we know how to keep not worrying about running out of power. And by not worrying about that, we continue to optimize for getting more fuel out of the ground, because there's nothing like fossil fuels for its energy density. Most of us didn't study physics. We don't really understand the laws of thermodynamics. We have a notion that you can't have a perpetual motion machine. That's clear. But that we can continue to live the way we live and not ultimately run out of that fuel and continue to damage the entire living planet, the entire biosphere, while we're doing it. We can see Trump making incredible decisions. I saw where we had a requirement that the few grizzlies that are left in the United States protected today to have at least, I think, 2,500 acres per grizzly in the population so that they can actually survive with the kind of territory, habitat for which they evolved and can thrive in. Trump is saying 1 acre is enough for them. And he keeps making more and more decisions that are all about keeping the price of our fossil fuels low and getting more of it out of the ground, because his thinking is short term. Some of our thinking is not that short term. We think about the life that we're leaving for our children. We think about what will our grandchildren inherit. Think about that. It is amazing to me about how we can't see that. But I come to seeing that most people didn't have my experience of being a software engineer and seeing what can go wrong and continuously upgrading systems and seeing how they can do more wrong more quickly, because there are always unintended consequences to every system. No system is perfect, except for maybe that which nature has created. I'll keep coming back to it because nature was created from the bottom up over billions of years through evolution, through adaptation. That's where we need to see ourselves in the future, part of that natural world. People will often come to me and say, yeah, but aren't we part of nature? Aren't we showing how well nature can evolve a species? We're not evolving. We're on what's called an evolutionary dead end. I get worked up on this, but for good reason. People fall back that we're doing is about trying to find better ways that are a little bit less harmful, and therefore we can keep what we've got as a main industrial civilization, which we think is a real benefit to humanity, and still continue to have it for future generations. We continue to optimize for everybody having more. That we call growth. And our economic system was built around that. But so was our legal system. So was our justice system. So was the idea of having corporations that could facilitate everybody having more. And everybody having more is sort of the underlying optimization that all of our systems orient towards. So when we look to solutions, we look to doing things. We're not ready to give up having more. We're not ready to have systems that would give us less. How about we don't have 24/7 electrification, and we give up on the belief that just because solar radiation, tides, and wind are essentially free, we're not using the wind for a sailboat. But when we build a wind farm and the sun's radiation is free, if we want to warm ourselves and be able to soak up those rays, we're helping ourselves. And when we build our buildings, our homes, to face the sun with windows, we let it in. And if it's too much, we have overhangs, not air conditioning. You know, the air conditioning has allowed us to live in places that are far too hot. And that's coming home to roost now, because eventually the grid won't be able to support all those air conditioners and all those AI servers. So there will be brownouts, there will be blackouts, and they won't come at a convenient time. They'll come out for people that are living in the desert or in a place that's getting well over 100 degrees. And we're seeing this throughout the world, different countries. We saw it in India. We see it in France. We've seen it in our country. You know, we're cold right now in the Bay Area for a while, and that feels good for a change. But in January, I remember we had 90 plus temperatures. It's not climate change. It's out of control climate chaos. The streams of how weather flows around this globe are changing. And eventually, with the North Pole's ice melting, with the addition of the volume of water that's coming from Antarctica and glaciers in mountain countries that is going out to the sea level will rise, it'll push us around. We will see many more effects that are much worse than what we complain about today. We'll be scrambling to survive. All of the goodies that we have in place because of industrialization, they will be gone. The stores will be closed. The gas stations won't be open. And the electric grid will go down. And if we're lucky, we might be able to reconstruct some local electrification. I'm reminded of the example of what Cuba experienced after the USSR left them and no longer supplied them with fossil fuels. They struggled, just like they're struggling now because of our wanting to dominate that part of the hemisphere. I remember when I was doing a talk show in West Marin, we had on a fellow that experienced that time. And one of the things that stood out in what he said is they might get 1 or 2 or 3 hours a day of some electricity. They didn't know when. Often it was in the afternoon, but they would definitely always plan for what were the priorities they were going to use that power for when it came. That's the mindset that I think we need now. That's having to not because we want to. Nobody wants to have less, travel less, drive less, have less food options, have less comfort. People think that what we have is going to continue, but we're seeing it start to crumble. A lot of people think, oh, as soon as we have the next election, things will be better. That's not a change in the system that we have. That system will continue to be prioritized for growth, not healthy watersheds. They'll be prioritized for wealth creation, not preserving the soils or the watershed. Taking down the dams everywhere would mean we wouldn't have as much power as we think we need to run everything. Yeah, but we have seen how taking down dams on the Klamath River, for example, brings back the salmon. The salmon brings nutrients upstream. It's not just the survival of the salmon, but that whole watershed is enhanced by what had evolved in a natural way to give us the diversity of life that we enjoy, that we want to keep, but we don't keep it by seeing a species nearing extinction because of habitat loss and then trying to find means to protecting a little bit of habitat somewhere so they can live a little longer before they go extinct. We need to bite the bullet and come to an understanding that nothing short of rethinking our priorities is going to help. Clearly, we need to optimize for life, because if not, we too are part of that extinction. I don't see us doing much of that. I'm on social media and connected to people who have that perspective and share a lot of studies and a lot of thinking and a lot of good information about it. But that's a small subset of what social media is about. Most of social media is about entertainment. Nowadays, it's being AI produced to be more and more fantastical so that people can enjoy the escape from their real lives, which are experiencing lots of problems. I suggest we stop reading science fiction or watching science fiction. I suggest we stop creating these fake realities that entertain us and that can drive business to our services. I suggest we imagine instead that we're living more like people used to live. Yes, it was a hardship in those days, but we're going to face a much greater hardship. We're really unprepared for what's ahead. We have lost the skills to do for ourselves. We should be planning for a future that is clear as day to a few of us, but shall becoming clearer every day to the rest of us. For years, I believed that civilization was broken. But when I started remembering my first career of writing software, when a program consistently produced results that nobody wanted, errors were created that caused errors in customer billing, caused errors in the white pages when they were published, in the yellow pages, but we always had somebody to take care of that problem. The first place every engineer should look isn't at what's going wrong. It's what were the original requirements? Is there a requirements document to refer to? What were the priorities for this system to begin with? Are those the priorities today? That's where we should begin looking as well when it comes to the systems that are part of our life. So before asking how to solve a problem, we need to ask what system has been optimized to produce. That single question may tell us more than all the proposed solutions that we want to think of. Bye-bye.